Obviously, to discuss that requires a certain sense of history, understanding of international politics principles, what's actually been going on within the Clinton administration, and a knowledge of current events. Certainly, Dr. Haas brings all of that equipment to the table in discussing this fascinating topic. And we are in a period of time where the interest in the underlying principles of American policy is probably more intense than it has been at any time in the past 6 years. And for all of us, not just historians certainly, for all of us today, it's an extraordinarily interesting and important topic. Mr. Haass brings to the table, as I say, all the right equipment. He's a graduate of Oberlin College, Oxford Rhodes Scholar, and while as a Rhodes Scholar, he did get both the master's degree and the PhD. He's had experience in the intellectual world, certainly. He's been a director of national security programs at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been a visiting professor at Hamilton College, also a lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School at Harvard. He's been a senior associate at Carnegie and a research associate at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. His experience in government has been extensive. He was in the Defense Department for a year, the State Department from 1980 to 1983. Among his assignments there was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European Affairs when he came here in November of 1983 and addressed this council on the topic of Euro missiles and the future of East-West relations, which have taken a form that he may not have anticipated fully at that time. He was with the Bush administration from 1989 to 93. He was a special assistant to President Bush and senior director of Near East and South Asian affairs on the NSC staff. In 1991, for that work, he was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and the articulation of U.S. policy during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Now he has the very prestigious position of Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution, squarely in the middle of the American intellectual community, which is so important to our understanding of foreign affairs, as an example of his intellectual interests and their aptness. Among his 8 books are The Reluctant Sheriff, The United States After the Cold War, major topic policy area of economic sanctions and American diplomacy, and immediately relevant intervention, the use of American military force in the post-Cold War era. We're extremely fortunate to have him with us tonight. It's my great pleasure to present to you Richard Haass.
Thank you for that generous introduction. Clearly among my skills is not time management or navigation. And I apologize to all of you for keeping you sitting here. I hope you are well fed and had a few drinks. And if that's the case, you probably won't mind whatever it is I have to say. My topic tonight is the foreign policy of the Clinton administration. And I will do my best to avoid any cheap shots or cheap jokes with that title about how short my talk will be or something to that effect. What I'd like to do, though, is say something about how the administration began, what have been the basic contours of their foreign policy, and then something about their legacy. And then, again, what I really hope to do is preserve the bulk of our time for your comments or questions, and basically let me know where I've got it wrong. Bill Clinton and Al Gore rode into Washington literally on a bus just over 6 years ago. And if you remember, the mantra of their coming was, "It's the economy, stupid." It was the mantra of the campaign. And what it represented was a sense that after the end of the Cold War, that the United States found itself in a very rare moment historically, where we essentially could put our feet up and no longer facing a major international threat. And we had the luxury to focus on domestic problems, first and foremost from their perspective, the economy. And what we've seen over the last 6 years, with very few exceptions, is the continuation of that bias. The sense that we live, again, in a very benign international environment. There's no successor to the Soviet Union, no great imminent threat, no geopolitical competitor. And that the United States, therefore, should take advantage of this uncharacteristic period where we enjoy tremendous advantage, what one friend of mine calls a surplus of power, and essentially turn our energies inward. And if you see then the Clinton administration, that explains, we just lost this, I think, that explains, for example, just want me to keep going or what?
Don't have to.
Okay. If you can't hear me, let me know. I'll try to speak up. And if anyone can hear me, just raise your hand, unless you're happy with that fact. The focus was such things as redoing health care, indeed the major domestic initiative at the beginning of the Clinton era, ending welfare as we knew it, to use the campaign slogan. Obviously, budget issues, restoring economic growth in the United States, though, to be historically fair, the last quarter of the Bush era was quite robust, with growth kicking in at over 4%. Indeed, in our house at least, this is known as the Bush recovery, but so be it. And obviously, and such things as launching a national dialogue about race. And if you look, for example, it's an interesting thing to do. If you look at the President's States of the Union addresses, the half dozen or so he's given, and you add up all the paragraphs devoted to things domestic as opposed to things foreign, what you will see is an overwhelming percentage, 90% or more, devoted to things domestic, economic and social, but not overseas. Or similarly, if you look at all the Saturday radio addresses, again, the overwhelming percentage of these addresses has been devoted to things domestic. And if I had to characterize the idea of the Clinton administration foreign policy, in some ways it was the idea that less is more. That the purpose of this era, of this presidency, was to put its stamp on domestic matters, on economic matters, and basically hope the world remains a fairly calm place. Now, there was talk of foreign policy, to be sure and to be fair. And indeed, early on in the administration, every year, the administration would publish a kind of overview of its foreign policy. And the words such as promotion of democracy, democratic enlargement, and engagement were essentially the hallmarks. And the idea was the United States would stay involved in the world, it was anti-isolationist, and that the principal purpose of American foreign policy was to enlarge the circle of democracies. And this explains, for example, the push to enlarge NATO, which the initial phase of which has happened. NATO has gone from an alliance of 16 to an alliance of 19. And essentially an emphasis on trying to bring democracy to Russia, to promote human rights and democratic reform in China, to promote democracy in the former parts of the Soviet Union and former members of the Eastern Bloc, to lock in democracy, the democratic gains in Latin America, to bring it to Africa, and so forth. That essentially became the intellectual argument, or doctrine, if you will, of the Clinton administration. The problem is that in many cases, while this may have been the rhetorical doctrine, it provided precious little guidance for what to do. That there was essentially a disconnect between the words and the kinds of problems that were showing up in people's inboxes. What did you do about, say, a Somalia, or a Bosnia, or a Haiti? Or what about all the other problems in Russia that weren't necessarily going to be fixed by more democracy? Or in the case of China, did we really have the luxury of concentrating on human rights if we wanted Chinese help in stabilizing the Korean Peninsula, or avoiding a conflict over Taiwan, or we wanted to expand our exports to China, or what have you? So what you had was essentially an administration that came to town with a set of biases to focus on the country, to spread democracy around the world, but what it found out really were two things: that it really often didn't have the luxury of ignoring the world, and when it did have to focus on the world, simply promoting democracy didn't really help you all that much. There were too many questions that wasn't the answer for. So what has that added up to in the way of legacy? And when I talk about this, I'll go over what I think have been the principal accomplishments and some of the principal problems. I think economics, not surprisingly, was the centerpiece of the foreign policy. And here I'd say the administration got off to a very good start, and indeed it was really bipartisan, and two branches, Congress and the executive working together. In the first term, you had NAFTA, and then you had the World Trade Organization passing. So what you did was put down two major foundation stones of international economic relations early on in the administration. The problem, though, is that nothing has happened since. Indeed, the fast track authority, the ability of a president to negotiate trade agreements with foreign governments and then submit them to the Congress in a manner that would preclude the Congress amending them, because any amendment would force them to go back and renegotiate. So fast track authority was allowed to lapse. And now it's been more than 4 years since the president has had that authority, and not surprisingly, there's no new trade agreements. And indeed, what we're seeing is in some ways the picking up of domestic opposition to open trading arrangements. Where I think, though, they have done extremely well is the area of promoting open international economies. Indeed, until recently, one could have argued that the principal crisis of the Clinton administration was the Asia and then global economic crisis. And I think here Mr. Rubin and Mr. Summers deserve a great deal of credit. And indeed, part of the credit they deserve was resisting bad ideas, people who suggested these new fixes, that what we needed was a new architecture, a new IMF, a new World Bank, some big solution. And instead saying, no, we don't need anything that big. You know what we need? We need a lot of accountants. Now, many of you are sitting here probably never thought that accountants were the answer to any problem. Indeed, were perhaps the source of many problems. But as it turns out, it's a good idea. What essentially you needed were good, generally accepted accounting principles, transparencies, open books, so that people who wanted to invest could invest with confidence, knowing where the money was going to go. The rule of law, so the investment would be safe. Essentially the political framework for economic activity. So they said, we really don't need dramatic economic, new institutions, new architecture. What we really need is a little bit of interior decorating. Get these countries to open up, to be transparent, to use the word of the 90s, to follow proper accounting practices, and essentially the money will go. They do that, and the money will follow. Get rid of bribery, get rid of the corruption, open it up, and the market will invest where it looks attractive. And people are no longer talking about the Asia or global economic crisis. It is essentially over. I'm not saying it can't return, but for the time being, we've weathered the storm. Money investment is beginning to flow in places that look stable and attractive, and I think the administration handled that very well. So I think in those areas, in trade and where the administration began, and in the financial system where the administration has ended up, I think historians will give Mr. Clinton and his cabinet, particularly people at Treasury, very high marks. The second area where I think they will get at least mixed marks, I used to be a professor, so I have some idea about how to grade here, would be in the area of dealing with weapons of mass destruction. And I think one of the great unsung accomplishments of the administration was to persuade the former republics of the Soviet Union. If you recall, when the Soviet Union broke up, nuclear weapons weren't just located in Russia, but nuclear weapons were located in 3 of the other republics, a large amount in Ukraine alone. And what the administration did was, working with them, persuaded these 3 republics to give up their nuclear weapons. So immediately we contained the problem. And also on their watch, South Africa has given up its nuclear weapons. Brazil and Argentina have essentially precluded going that route. So in that case, there's been some clear progress. Alas, on the other side of the coin, you have the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests, which is obviously a problem. And you've had the inability of the United States and Russia to bring down their arsenals. You've had agreements on paper, but the agreements have not been implemented. So we still now have roughly, 6,500 nuclear warheads that are ready to rock, that are ready to go on each side. You've got tens of thousands of more stored away. You've got the material to make even tens of thousands more than that. So the nuclear menace, the most unfortunate of all residues of the Cold War, is still with us. And not a lot has been done. So there's been a little bit of progress, but in some ways what remains for the successor administrations is still to deal with this great residue. We don't think about it a lot, but I would say that, ironically enough, the threat of a nuclear accident, a nuclear catastrophe even, is much greater today than it was at virtually any moment of the Cold War, perhaps excepting those days around the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where would I give the administration somewhat lower grades, now that I've been uncharacteristically generous? One is in the area of great power relations. History, when all else is said and done, is more than anything else the study of relations among the major power centers of the day, the states that have the greatest concentrations of political, economic, and military power. We are clearly number one. We are first among equals or first among unequals, to be more accurate. But then you've also got China, Japan, Russia, and Europe. Clearly major concentrations of policy. And there, in virtually every case, I would argue that U.S. relations are in worse shape today than they were 6 years ago. With China, what we've seen, not simply in the wake of the embassy bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, this powerful outpouring of xenophobia and anti-Americanism and nationalism, which was tolerated by the government but not stirred up, or not created by the government, perhaps. It's real. And you've had some basic U.S.-Chinese problems about Taiwan, about proliferation, clearly about human rights, and about Kosovo itself. I was in China about a month ago, and 90% of my conversation with them, with the Chinese, was about the whole concept of Kosovo and what they considered to be the illegitimacy of what, again, they called international interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. Clearly, they saw everything in Kosovo through the prism of Tibet or Tiananmen Square or Taiwan. They clearly didn't like the precedent of the international community getting involved. I just raised this, though, to say that the United States and China have clearly not come together on what the rules ought to be of post-Cold War international relations, of what ought to animate or shape their relationship. We now have a trade deficit with China of $57 billion. And though my colleagues at Brookings in the economics department tell me bilateral trade deficits don't matter, I don't understand why not. Clearly, politically, it matters a great deal. We do have differences with China, for example, about the spread of unconventional weaponry. We do have differences about democracy, about markets, and so forth. So you have these very important differences. And again, we've yet to put this relationship on anything like a sound footing. The fact that, I'm not sure if it was released today or any day now, you're going to have the release of the Cox report, which is going to detail years of Chinese espionage, and the fact that through this espionage, China essentially leapfrogged a generation in the development of its nuclear weapons is going to have an impact. China is clearly emerging as a potential great power, and as a great power, as a potential geopolitical competitor. And one of the, the president is fond of describing our relationship with China as a strategic constructive partnership, but it ain't that, and we ain't there. And I would simply say finding a formula for U.S.-Chinese relations is, if anything, more distant today than it was 6 years ago. Russia, similarly. Tremendous hopes when the administration took office about the U.S.-Russian relationship, a lot of optimism, and it hasn't worked out. A lot of the problem, obviously, because of Russian internal developments, the struggles of Russian democracy, their own economic failures, their corruption, and so forth. But clearly, some of the economic advice we dispensed was impractical. Russia was not ready or able to go from 0 to 60 in 6 seconds. The demand for instant openness in some ways overloaded its circuits. It couldn't handle the pressures of global capitalism, of globalization. The promises we made and then didn't deliver about aid clearly created reactions, negative reactions, what we're doing in Kosovo and so forth, NATO enlargement. All these things added up, and again, U.S.-Russian relations, after a lot of optimism, have yet to find a solid post-Cold War footing. And you'll notice it because this December there are parliamentary elections in Russia. Next June there's presidential elections, and all the candidates are going to be competing for the mantle of who can be more anti-American than now. Again, very powerful stirrings of nationalism. Japan, the world's second largest economy, is in a gradual decline, and the United States, despite all of its pressure, has not been able to shake Japan out of it. We've not been able to persuade Japan of the need for it to reform, to deregulate, to open up and become a locomotive rather than a ball and chain on the global economy. Case of Western Europe, growing disagreements over things like economic sanctions, over bananas and beef hormones, over essentially the role of the United States and Western Europe, in the world. Again, we had an alliance that brought us close together during the Cold War. We had the glue of opposition to the Soviet Union. Again, we've yet to find a formula for a new relationship. Here we are 10 years after the end of the Cold War. 1999 is the 10th anniversary of the wall going down, the Berlin Wall going down, and yet we've yet to come up with a new formula, as we are seeing, for example, every day in Kosovo, the disagreements about how to respond to the crisis there. Which brings me to the next area of problems, which has been humanitarian interventions. One of the principal criticisms lodged against the administration has been its penchant for social work. that essentially it's gotten involved in Somalia, it's gotten involved in Haiti, it's now gotten involved in Bosnia and Kosovo. It has become the principal foreign policy focuses, or is it foci? Never knew that. Concentrations and emphases of this administration, and there's not a lot to show for it. That we've been late in using military force. When we have used it, we've not used it very effectively. Haiti is beginning to deteriorate again badly. Somalia, we left after 18 Americans were killed. Kosovo, clearly whatever else we are going to accomplish there, it is not the protection of the nearly 2 million inhabitants of that province. The figuring out of how to react, how to use force effectively when humanitarian but less than vital interests are at stake is a puzzle that has thus far not been cracked. Progress with North Korea, yes, and trying to come up with a formula to keep North Korea from developing weapons of mass destruction, but that seems to be unraveling. North Korea, based on recent intelligence, may again be once again in the business of making nuclear weapons. We're not sure. Of much greater concern is Iraq. We've not heard Iraq on the news the last 6 months to any great extent. But the one thing you can be sure is that now that UN weapons inspectors are not in Iraq, Iraqi scientists are busy. And one day Iraq will pop up on our TV screens, and what concerns me when it does, it'll be Iraq that once again has weapons of mass destruction. I don't know if they'll be chemical, biological, nuclear, or some combination of the three, but the one thing we know is that Iraq is in no way reformed. If one likes cancer analogies, Saddam Hussein is a cancer in remission. He is not cured. And sooner or later we will be hearing from him again, and it will be noisy and messy when we do. In short, if I had to add it all up, I would simply say the world is not a safer place today than it was when Mr. Clinton took office. To the contrary, I think the world is a less safe place than it was 6 years ago. Now, he may have some opportunities to do something about it. For example, the recent election in Israel opens up certain opportunities for peacemaking that were not there. He still has opportunities to consolidate a peace process in Northern Ireland and so forth. Anytime a president has more than a year and a half to go, it's way too soon to be closing the book, drawing up legacies, and so forth. But I would simply say, at this point, at the three-quarters mark of the, or if one likes basketball analogy, since this is the season, at the beginning of the fourth quarter of the Clinton presidency, essentially I would argue that the world is a less safe place than it was. Now, to some extent, one could say that was inevitable because of domestic trends in certain countries, but I also think it wasn't inevitable, that it's also because of things we've done, or more important, things that we haven't done. And where I would end up is to say that we began this period, this presidency 6 years ago, and indeed I'd even go back to the last year, year and a half of his predecessor's presidency, where the United States had tremendous advantages. And essentially we haven't thought hard or worked hard about how to translate these advantages into lasting gains, about how to take or exploit the surplus of political and economic and military power that we are lucky enough to enjoy, and how to try to build lasting arrangements internationally so that for the next 5, 10, 15 years, what have you, or longer, great power relations would be placed on a smoother track and so forth. I think we pay a price for the lack of attention, for the fact that this is not only the post-Cold War world, but it's also the post-containment world. The old doctrine of foreign policy no longer applies, but we've yet to put a new doctrine in its place. So what we have in the United States is not isolationism. To be an isolationist, you have to care passionately about foreign policy. And you have to basically care passionately about foreign policy and say, we don't want to have foreign policy. But what you have in the United States is not that. What you have is really much more disinterest. It's a lack of interest in foreign policy, a lack of concern, a general unwillingness to place our resources, whether they're financial or human, at the call of foreign policy. And I think the president's coming to office and what he's done has reflected that, but it's also fed into that. The president and his pollsters have sensed that the American people are not particularly interested in foreign policy, and instead of fighting that, instead of resisting it, instead of making the argument that in the long run there's no distinction between domestic and foreign policy, that ultimately what happens in the world will come back to either help us or haunt us, whether it's trade or disease or violence or immigration or drugs, what have you, or nuclear weapons or terrorism, that ultimately we'll only be safe and prosperous at home if we're safe and prosperous abroad. That argument hasn't essentially been made. And what worries me is that sooner or later, this benign moment where the United States has these tremendous advantages will begin to fade, and it already is. And it'll fade because of two things. It'll fade because of the gradual rise of power elsewhere, whether it's the Chinas, the Russias, terrorist organizations, the Iraqs, the North Koreas, what have you. Or it'll happen also because of the relative disinterest and decline of the United States. Our spending now on national security, for example, if you add it all up, is at a post-World War II low. And the combination of a rise in opposition to the United States around the world, an American disinterest, a disinclination to devote resources, a disinclination to run the risk of casualties, so we fight wars from the air, even if they don't promise to be effective. What worries me is that we may be squandering what is, by any historical measure, an extraordinary opportunity to make the world a safer and more prosperous place for years or even decades to come. So at the end of the day, when historians write the foreign policy legacy of Mr. Clinton, I think the bottom line will be Mr. Clinton should be praised for a few things he did, but mainly he should be criticized for the many things that he didn't do. In this case, less turned out not to be more, but less turned out to be less. Thank you very much. The question was essentially that I seem to be recommending a 1999 version of colonialism, arguing for greater American involvement in the affairs of other countries. Let me give that a qualified yes. But let me, or as Al Haig would say, let me caveat that in two ways. One is, I am interested in a kind of colonialism on the following basis. I think states or governments are not the only players in the world who have rights. I also think people have rights, and I also think governments and states have obligations. It's kind of a contract. And when governments violate the terms of their contract and the people are powerless to take them to court or do anything about it, then I think the international community has something of a right or an obligation to act. And so in that sense, yes, I do think in situations where you have gross violations of human rights, genocide, and where we can think of ways to intervene with a military force or sanctions or some other way, that we can make a bad situation tolerable at a reasonable cost, yes, I think the international community ought to act. So to that extent, I plead guilty to the charge. And I would simply say when the United States doesn't act, as in the case of Rwanda, 1 million innocent people lost their lives. Inaction ought to be judged just as rigorously as any potential policy course, because inaction has tremendous consequences. And I don't think sovereignty ought to be an absolute. When sovereignty is abused, I think we ought to look to ways to redress it on behalf of the victims of the abuse. Secondly, I would use a different word than colonialism for another point, which is I plead guilty to being a kind of imperialist. And I don't mean imperialist in the Leninist sense or whatever, in the 19th century, that I want to go around the world creating colonies to exploit people, but imperial in the sense of law, of rulemaking. I want international relations to be conducted according to certain laws. I don't want it to be anarchy. I just talked about one. I want to have certain rules about how governments treat their people. I want to have certain rules about when it's legitimate to use military force. I want to have certain rules about weapons of mass destruction. I want to have certain norms about economic openness, about free trade, and so forth. So yeah, I think the United States ought to be an imperial power, essentially articulating a vision of how international society ought to be structured, how it ought to be operated, and try to persuade other people to sign up to it. Not to coerce them, not to ram it down its throats, because we can't do that. However powerful we are, there are still limits to our power. And ironically enough, the harder we try to impose our views, will not only exhaust ourselves, but will stimulate opposition to ourselves. But I do think there is a case for the United States essentially being an imperial power. And ironically enough, one of the advantages of that is that if we succeed, it will actually lessen the burdens on ourselves. We will not bankrupt or exhaust ourselves in the process, only though if we can get others to sign up to this concept of international relations. The unfair question from the gentleman over there was how, if the Bush administration had been reelected, its policy on Bosnia would have changed or been different from Mr. Clinton's.
Been different than the results that we have in Bosnia now.
The short answer is I don't know. It's too facile for me to stand up here and say it would have been better or different. I was critical of the Bush administration's policy. I think what the Bush administration didn't do in 1991 and 1992 was a mistake. I think we should have been much more careful in trying to regulate the diplomatic process of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Any recognition that the United States and Europe put forward should have been conditional on the constituent parts agreeing to certain principles, for example, how they treat minorities. And when violence began, I think the United States should have been more willing to use force. The Bush administration wouldn't do it in Bosnia. I think that was a mistake. I think that at that point, military force was arguably a better policy than inaction. The concern at the time in the Bush administration was that it wasn't clear that a little bit of military force would work. It wasn't clear that a lot of military force was warranted by our interests. And the administration said, since we can't be sure that a little bit of force will work, better to stay back than to get involved. It's a legitimate argument, and even in retrospect, I'm not sure it was wrong. I just leaned the other way. What Mr. Bush and company would have done had they been returned to office, I don't know. Too many variables there. Whether it would have turned out different or better than what Mr. Clinton did, who knows? I would simply say that clearly, though, the Clinton policy that did evolve was also an example of too little, too late. We essentially dithered for several years. The situation on the ground deteriorated, and it wasn't until NATO air power connected to Croatian land power did it ultimately make the Dayton Accord possible. I would simply say, extending that to the present, we then went ahead and learned the wrong lesson from it. And we basically fell in love with limited applications of air power. And we thought that because it worked in Bosnia, it would also work in Kosovo. And alas, we have paid, and others have paid dearly for that miscalculation. The question is, it's a tough one. What are the principles I would espouse or sign up to for the use of ground forces in interfering or intervening in the affairs of a sovereign state? Let me broaden it to military forces rather than just ground forces, because ground forces is a tactical question. I would suggest a few things. One is it has to be bad. And at the risk of seeming more morally callous than I usually appear, not every repression is a genocide. And I think the first question you've got to ask yourself is, how bad is it? Because you can't intervene everywhere all the time. So that's one thing. Secondly, you've got to say, can I design a military operation that is likely to work at a cost I'm willing to pay? Not every situation lends itself. For example, imagine the situation in Chechnya. That was a situation which was, a very bad humanitarian situation inside a sovereign state. Would it have been wise to go in? The answer is no, because we could not have designed a military operation at an affordable price, because part of the price we would have paid was risking nuclear war. Or the same thing with Tiananmen Square, if that had been worse. So I think you've got to ask yourself, can you design something that could accomplish good on the ground at a price that is somehow not out of line with the interests at stake, and particularly with the gravity of the humanitarian situation. Thirdly, you've got to ask yourself what other interests are at stake. And do these other interests argue for or against intervention? For example, the two cases I just mentioned, China and Russia, your other interests at stake argued against intervention. At the time of Chechnya or Tiananmen, because you had much larger interests that you would have jeopardized. In the case of Kosovo, the administration debatedly argued that our other interests, European stability, NATO, and so forth, argued in favor of intervention. But at least you've got to ask that question about how do other interests affect it. Next, you've got to ask yourself, what other instruments are available and how do they look? So before I settle on military force in whatever form, air power, ground power, some mixture of the two, what will happen if I do nothing? What will happen if I have conferences? What will happen if I have political sanctions? What will happen if I have economic sanctions? What about covert action? Essentially, what are the other tools in the kit bag likely to produce? What's the likely costs and benefits of those? And then lastly, I would probably ask questions about what kind of international support am I going to have, particularly from regional states? And I think to the extent regional states are willing and able to work with you, that adds a lot of bounce or legitimacy and viability to your intervention, because they know often the local language, the terrain. They have a tremendous stake in stability because they don't want to have refugee flows across their border. But if local states aren't willing to get involved, or you don't have a lot of international support and you've got to bear a lot of it or all of it yourself, you've really got to ask yourself why. Can you do it effectively? Is it worth it? And so forth. I could probably, if pressed, think of a few other criteria. But that's the sort of checklist I'd go down. And I think as a policymaker, what you don't end up with is kind of a handy-dandy checklist that tells you whether to go in or not. What I think you end up with, though, is a set of questions that you always ought to ask yourself, and you ought to be able to satisfy yourself and satisfy the American people that you've gone down this checklist and that you can basically make the case for why you stay out, or if you go in, why you go in, and why you go in the form that you go in. But I think you've got to be willing to ask yourself those questions and hold up those answers to public and international scrutiny. Now, missing from my list, and I'm sorry to go on so long, is the idea of the UN Security Council, that they have to bless it. I do not think the UN Security Council should have to bless interventions, in large part because there's not international consensus there. I talked before about China and Russia. Both China and Russia have very different views about the legitimacy of intervention in sovereign affairs. So to give them a veto over this, I can't see any reason why. So my feeling is, while it's nice to have UN Security Council blessing, I would not want to make that the be-all and end-all. It's a consideration, but for me, it's by no means decisive or determinative. Two questions. The first is whether I think the idea of arming the Albanians, in particular the Kosovo Liberation Army, the insurgency group, is a good idea. And second of all, once this situation is resolved diplomatically, would I favor economic aid, I assume, for the rebuilding of Serbia? Let me take the second one first. Short answer there, no. Or a better answer is I would only favor economic aid for rebuilding Serbia if the people there oust their government. I think a condition of any reconstruction aid for Serbia ought to be that there's a democratically elected government. And if that incentivizes the people there to launch a coup, great. I would probably provide limited humanitarian help if people in Yugoslavia were, in Serbia were starving, food and medicine. I don't believe on moral reasons we should deny that. But reconstruction aid, I would link to Mr. Milosevic and company being out of power. Well, we can talk about Iraq. It's a different argument, and I'm prepared to talk about that if people want to. In this case, I would simply do that. And it's also, as a pragmatic thing, I don't think Congress or anyone would support it. It'd be very hard to go to your citizens and say why we should be giving aid to reconstruct Yugoslavia while someone like Mr. Milosevic is still in power. I, for one, wouldn't support it. I would support, obviously, the reconstruction of Kosovo so that people could go back and return, but that's a separate matter. Would I support arming the insurgency? Answer, no. I do not favor necessarily a greater Albania, which is their goal. To start redrawing the maps of Europe is something that makes me nervous. Secondly, their means are not exactly the means of Boy Scouts. And one of the things we should have learned from Afghanistan is that once you put arms in the hands of people, you lose a good deal of control. It's a cheap way of fighting a war. The good news is Americans don't not buy. The bad news is we lose control over how these weapons are used. And it can come back and haunt us or bite us and others down the road. It would, by the way, cause a major disagreement with the Europeans who don't want to see people running all over Europe with the arms. But most of all, I think arming the KLA guarantees Mr. Milosevic staying in power. If you recall, that was his rationale for going in to Kosovo. I think it was a cooked-up rationale, but there would be no way to basically no better way to underline his rationale than to arm the KLA. Then Milosevic or someone like him would stay in power because they would be fighting a civil war, they thought, for their lives. Because again, the agenda of the KLA will be a greater Albania. And any, not just Milosevic, but any Serbian leader, in my view, likely to come to power would resist that agenda. So no, I don't think that's the right way to go. That was a question only to the extent the gentleman's voice went up a little bit at the end. So it's going to be hard for me to restate it as a question. But it seemed to be, tell me if I've got it right here, that I seem to be favoring the U.S. remaining the world's only superpower, which is something the administration seems to favor more than the opposition. Opposition?
You're criticizing the administration for taking your viewpoint, in other words.
Well, let me say two things. One is, or three things. One, I don't think it should be the goal of the United States to be the world's only superpower. for two reasons. One is it's not possible. We can't control the rise of other nations. If China or someone else is going to become a superpower, they're going to become one. It's largely the internal things, economics, culture, political order, and so forth. So it's silly to set goals that you can't attain. Second of all, being a superpower to me is not an end in itself. The purpose of American foreign policy shouldn't simply be American primacy. The purpose of American foreign policy ought to be to translate our primacy into something that we want, whether it's a definition of international society or world order that protects our interests and promotes our values. I want to use our advantage. I want to spend it. I don't want it to be an end in itself. Secondly, the Clinton administration talks the talk of the United States being the world's indispensable nation, but it doesn't walk the walk. I mean, you can't, what good is it being the world's great superpower if you arbitrarily say, we're not going to use ground forces here as we've done in Kosovo, or we're not going to fight for the right to negotiate trade agreements because we're worried about how the AFL-CIO might react at the next congressional reaction, or we're not going to push a WTO agreement with China, even though it's the better agreement than we ever thought we would get because we're worried about the politics of it. So it's one thing to have the rhetoric of American leadership. It's quite another thing to exercise it. Thirdly, I agree, though, with your last point. I think Congress has been disappointing. It's interesting. The contract with America, it was a contract about America. It barely mentioned foreign policy. Indeed, the only foreign policy elements of the contract for America were essentially shots at the UN. It essentially ignored international relations, and I don't think Republicans have distinguished themselves on Kosovo or a lot of other issues. I think Republicans are as all over the map as Democrats. Indeed, it's one of the interesting things about the post-Cold War period. You really can't say what is a Republican approach to foreign policy or a Democratic approach. Each party has various tendencies. And I don't see the Republicans putting forth a particularly coherent critique or alternative. Indeed, one of the interesting questions of the campaign is whether Republicans will. One Republican so far has, more than any other, who is John McCain, who I think has put forward a very interesting critique on Kosovo. Whether he succeeds in then generalizing that to a more broad foreign policy critique, we'll see. Whether other Republican candidates follow suit, we'll see. How Mr. Gore and Mr. Bradley deal with that issue, we'll see. But I would like it. I would love for foreign policy to come to the front of the campaign. And quite honestly, it is my goal that the next president comes to Washington and on his wall he has a poster saying, "It's the world, stupid." And when that happens, then I'll feel good. Then I'll feel business is back. Yes, ma'am. The question is, what chance I think the Knicks have to win tonight? No, the question was, would I assess the impact of Mr. Clinton's character on foreign policy? The answer is it doesn't help, but how much it hurts, I don't know. I think we pay a price when people around the world see things in America they don't respect. And that's true of the LA riots or Columbine or Mr. Clinton's shenanigans. I think all those things hurt the image of the United States. It's hard to be a moral leader when we don't do it by example. And the example can be in the Oval Office or in the streets of Los Angeles or the streets of any other city. So I think we pay a certain price for that. Secondly, it also creates suspicions. It's not so much the character, but there was the wag the dog suspicion, which doesn't help. It's hard enough to generate support for active foreign policy under the best of circumstances without people being skeptical of your motives. So when people became more skeptical of Mr. Clinton, if you remember in Desert Fox late last year, because they thought he was trying to distract attention away from his domestic problems, it didn't make it any easier. And again, I don't know what the motives are. I don't get in that game. I can't figure out what motivates people to carry out the foreign policies they do. But the bottom line is it doesn't help that foreign policy does to some extent reflect the quality of a society, particularly when you're in our position, because we're trying to sell a model. We're basically telling other countries, follow our economy, adopt our economic model. We're telling other countries, be more open about human rights, be more democratic. And it's very interesting. When other countries say, look at the violence, or look at other things in our society, they go, well, we don't really want to be like you. And it makes them think twice about undertaking some of the reforms we're promoting, because they say, yeah, we like the 4 or 5% growth rates, but we don't like some of what comes along with it. And I think Mr. Clinton's problems simply make it a little bit more difficult for him to be an effective salesman for American foreign policy at home or abroad. That said, the problems go way beyond that, and I don't think he was a particularly effective foreign policy president before any of this happened. So I saw it as like a 10% burden, like a surcharge on his foreign policy rather than something that fundamentally undermined it. The question was, whatever happened to Cuba and Mr. Castro, and essentially, why do we keep it at arm's length, and isn't it time to rethink the embargo? On the question of Cuba, it's interesting. About a year ago, the Pentagon came up with a report, or a congressional report was done for the Pentagon, I'm not sure which. But what was interesting about it is it essentially declared that Cuba no longer represents a threat to the United States. And that's for two reasons. One is the end of the Cold War. You no longer have Soviet, missiles, that kind of thing there. And second of all, Cuba is no longer sending its soldiers to muck around Latin America or Africa. That's all Cuba can do to keep itself going. So Cuba clearly doesn't represent the threat to anyone but itself, essentially, anymore. And the only threat, essentially, I think it really poses to us is the threat, if you want to call it that, of massive immigration. And we have to think about that. I got to tell you, I find the Cuba debate high on my list of strange debates in Washington. High on my list. And that's saying something, as you know. There are a lot of strange debates in that town. If I had here someone on the, far left, maybe Mr. Wellstone or somebody like that, and Senator Helms, the two of them together, they would agree. They would probably agree on goals. They would say with Cuba, what we want to see is a rapid, peaceful transition in Cuba to a free market, open political system. We all know that we don't like the current system. We don't like Castro. We don't like the repression and the rest. And we want to open it up. And then they would diverge 180 degrees as to how to get from here to there. Mr. Helms would say, let's embargo it till the cows come home and basically keep the pressure on, and that will cause it to change. And other people say, no, that hasn't worked for 30, 40 years. It's only strengthened Castro. What you really want to do is just the opposite. You want to open it up. And the one thing Mr. Castro and company won't be able to resist is American ideas and American music and American tourists and American dollars that basically kill them with kindness. So you have these diametrically different ideas about how to deal with Cuba. And it's, by the way, a similar debate you see with Iran and some other countries. Basically, it's how you deal with the rogues in general. But Cuba, most of all, you see it. It's a non-debate because it's domestically very explosive, and until Florida has less electoral votes, it may remain that way. It's a very hard subject to have an open debate. There's also an intermediate course, which is essentially what's called conditional engagement or reciprocal engagement, and the idea is we would relax the embargo, desanction, in exchange for certain reforms. We've tried that before. The problem with that is that it gives Mr. Castro, it lets him keep his finger on the pulse of the relationship, and whenever he doesn't like it, he can do something like shoot down 2 planes to interrupt the process. But politically, that's probably the most that we can get through the American political system. So my hunch is after the election, you will probably see some gradual attempts to introduce greater degrees of conditional engagement, where we offer certain lessening of the embargo in exchange for certain political and economic reforms in Cuba. I think we'll get a little bit. I don't think we'll get too far because Castro probably perceives that too much openness is a threat to his and his party's position. But I clearly think that change is warranted. And the question is selling that domestically. And generational change in Cuba, in the Cuban-American community might change it. And generational change in Cuba itself might change it. So I think one day the policy will be very different. The problem is getting from here to there. Yeah, the question is, how serious is the Chinese theft of our nuclear and other secrets and the culpability of the Clinton administration? The theft is serious. I don't know all the details, but I've been following it somewhat, and it's clear to me that China leapfrogged a generation, that it really gained a whole lot of designs and technical stuff I don't begin to understand. The only science course I took was geology, and we called it rocks for jocks, and I didn't get a lot out of it. But from people who understand these things, I gather what the Chinese derived was extraordinary. in terms of miniaturization of warheads, accuracy improvements, and so forth, that it's more than an improvement of degree. It's an improvement of kind. And what I think it means is it will clearly accelerate the emergence of a Chinese strategic nuclear challenge threat to the United States. Right now it's marginal, but it won't be marginal in a decade. One. Two, clearly security at the labs, lax is an inadequate word. It was, if you're asking me the funny sort of question, the Howard Baker question, what did the administration know and when did they know it? And then what did they do about it? I think that's what the investigations have to go. I don't know. I don't know whether people, I'm sympathetic to people in power to the extent that a zillion things show up in your inbox, and only in retrospect do you often realize the things you ought to have focused on. So I'm not going to stand up here and deliver cheap shots. They should have done this. They should have done that. On the other hand, what I don't know is, one, whether they should have done some things and that they were very slow, and two, whether there was any reluctance to do things for fear of rocking boats and so forth. That's a more serious charge. I'm not leveling it. I think that's why you have congressional investigations. That's why you have other investigations. What I would say, though, and to me the more interesting question is, in a funny sort of way, I don't blame the Chinese. I assume they're spying on us. Everybody else is spying on us, too. For that matter, we're spying on everybody else. That's how the game is played. And if they weren't spying on us, they'd be nuts because we have the most advanced technology that we want. But I blame us. I blame us for being lax. We ought to know we are the #1 target for virtually every intelligence agency in the world. And we ought to protect the things worth protecting. One of the very few things that's clearly worth protecting are nuclear secrets that allows people to gain 20 years of knowledge about how to manufacture small nuclear weapons and send them with great accuracy. And the idea that we would not have had the tightest possible security around that boggles the mind. So shame on us. And to me, the proper reaction is we ought to really be looking at ourselves rather than talking about a new Cold War with China, but we also ought to understand that this is going to make China a much more serious military threat much sooner than would have been the case otherwise, and that's going to complicate this task of working out a post-Cold War relationship with China. Okay, the question is how much I credit Mr. Clinton, and 3 areas talked about were healthcare, the economy, and surplus. The bus illustration was true. They rode into town on a bus. That was a literal, not a metaphorical description. Look, in my talk, I said what I thought were the good things in the economic area internationally. I wasn't talking about domestic issues. I was simply saying that the emphasis on domestic issues to some extent had an opportunity cost, which was the amount of political and other capital that could be devoted to foreign policy. Healthcare, we could have a long debate about the Clinton plan. I would simply say that I actually think their proposals set back healthcare reform, though there's been a degree since then. Yes, the economy has improved, growth is phenomenal, and it happened on Mr. Clinton's watch, and I think he deserves some credit, as does the Republican Congress, as does, above all, Mr. Greenspan and Mr. Rubin. The same goes for the surplus. I think there has been a tremendous economic improvement. We are the envy of the world in that, and I think there is enough room there for both parties to take congratulations. That is an area where Democrats and Republicans, executive and Congress, work together. We have gotten we did get the deficit under control, and I think that'll be one of the positive legacies of the Clinton administration. That's a good thing that happened on his watch. That said, there's nothing in that, for the most part, that would have precluded him doing more on foreign policy. And again, as I said, the great tragedy of the Clinton administration's foreign policy is what he didn't do. And the fact that indeed you had things like a booming economy. What better time to institutionalize free trade? It'll be much harder if and when we hit an economic recession. Or if you have a budgetary surplus, what better time to devote some greater resources to national security rather than letting it fall to a post-World War II low? That if you, in a benign international environment, what better time to try to reshape relations with former foes and allies? So again, my critique is it's a hard one to make perhaps because it'll only show up over time. So it doesn't begrudge him the many good things he may have done domestically or even some of the good things he did in the international arena, but it does essentially criticize him for not exploiting what I think was the really almost ahistoric, the uncharacteristic opportunity he was given. And as a result, what he will hand off to his successors is a world that's not nearly as safe or as prosperous as it could and should have been. And that is my criticism of him.
Well, that was a marvelous summary, and I think a wise one. And the scoring, I think, was quite fair. And you've already applauded, but we can do it again.